Greetings on behalf of the New England CCIM chapter. I'm Michael Chase, chapter president for 2022. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Just as a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded. We will distribute slides after the presentation. Before we get started, we'd like to thank our annual sponsors, our gold sponsors, Geronimo Properties, Northmark, EBI Consulting, and AEI Consultants. Our silver sponsors, May Property Management and St. James Real Estate Advisors. I would also like to mention our charitable partner for 2022, New View Communities, a CDC organization promoting affordable housing in central Massachusetts. Please feel free to look us up and follow us on our website, social media, and also our YouTube channel. We'd also like to remind you about an upcoming education event coming on March 29th, feasibility analysis for transit-oriented multifamily. Please check us out and join us for that. For today's webinar, you can please feel free to type your questions into the chat bar. We will probably take a few of them along the way and then also certainly at the very end of the presentation. And at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Amanda Stevens-Snell, CCIM and Chair of Programs Committee, who will introduce today's speaker.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're excited to have Jason Hickey, who is president and CEO of Hickey and Associates, with us this morning. Jason's company provides site selection services to a diverse set of businesses around the world. I first heard Jason speak at an ITRA Global conference a few years back and was really impressed by the knowledge he was able to share with our group, and thought it would be a benefit to our chapter if he could share some of his data with us. Some of the data his company is looking at that may impact businesses here in the New England region, which could ultimately have an effect on our commercial real estate climate here. As we go through the program, as Michael mentioned, feel free to type any questions into the chat box. And just a reminder that we are recording. So Jason, turn it over to you.
Well, thanks so much. It's great to be here, and we've got a lot to talk about today, which is exciting. And there's an unprecedented amount of opportunity around government assistance and aid and programs. And there used to be tens of billions of dollars a year, and now there's literally trillions. And it's not just the benefits of which can help individuals and small companies and others that get a little bit more attention. These are some of the programs that not only are federally mandated, but many communities across New England and beyond are trying to engage their businesses to make sure that they stay healthy, they're hiring new people, and addressing really huge challenges that we're facing today, like workforce and supply chain and other stuff. So we've got a lot to talk about. As was mentioned, feel free to ask questions. We'll make sure there's plenty of time at the end to address those questions and possibly even during. But first, a little bit of background about us. So we're the largest independent site selection firm, meaning that we help everybody. And it's fun because all kind of different businesses, all kind of different types of industries, all kind of different countries and states and communities. And we love being an integrator of services of what we do, which excuse me, is often referred to as site selection, but underneath that umbrella are things such as labor analytics, supply chain, and incentives or government aid that we'll talk about today. So we have a lot to talk about, but we were founded about 4 decades. I'm a second generation leader of our firm, and we continue to see growth in this very unprecedented moment of time. Companies need a lot of help, and that's what we're going to address. One other bit of knowledge I want to make sure I share with you before we dive too much in. One of the things we're going to talk about is some of the research that we've recently conducted around credits and incentives and government assistance. We just came out with a huge North American update. It's free of charge and it's available to you. Just go to our website at the bottom at your convenience. You can download it, or I'll share with you my email and phone number. Call me or email me. I'll get your copy too. But it's important because it within has a lot of great detail that we're not able to pack into a session today. That'll go a much deeper dive into some of the things we'll talk about. So it's free, available. Hopefully it's a great resource. And we come out with these reports about once every 3 or 4 months, depending on different legislative cycles and things that are happening. So definitely stay tuned. There'll be much more to come because there's again, pretty unprecedented times that we're dealing with. and the ways the governments are reacting is very diverse. But first, one of the questions we get a lot, and this is a recent poll that we conducted, how often is your business, clients, projects considering incentives and real estate decisions? And so according to that recent poll, and it was all the above, different types of users of these benefits, you may or may not find this surprising, but about 50% of these entities consider incentives. I think some of you might think it's much more than that, some maybe a little bit less, but it's in the ecosystem of decision making today more than it ever has. When a company is considering a lease renewal, an investment in equipment, maybe nothing to do with real estate, or maybe a huge consolidation or a brand new manufacturing plant, major investment, but even a small piece, they think to themselves, geez, what are some of the programs out there? Many companies participated in the PPP program and other programs that were available to companies in some of the toughest stretches of the pandemic. Now many of those companies are turning around and saying, well, hey, how else can I engage the government? That was pretty exciting. So when we look at the incentive life cycle, and when companies ask and consider about incentives, it kind of fits into three different buckets. We've got initial entry, so brand new kind of greenfield site, could be in a new location, whatever it might be. Might be a sales office for 15 people. It could be a manufacturing semiconductor plant that has 1,000 people, many in betweens. There's incentives for all of that at different scales, of course, but there is aid for all different sizes and scales. Expansion is another thing. So brand new greenfield and expansions always hit the newspaper if it's big enough. Governors and mayors come down and cut ribbons and make big announcements. But what's often overlooked is that when you consolidate or even close down the site, there's incentives for that as well. Outplacement and retraining if you're otherwise kind of right-sizing a facility. That's important to make sure that your team, as they're transitioning the new positions, have the right kind of skills, and there's different connectivity there for government assistance. And the same thing with consolidation is that as you consolidate different sites, there could be an opportunity as well. Many communities across New England and beyond see that even just retaining workers right now is a commitment of which the government is there to potentially assist. So let's dive a little bit deeper just into understanding, just for a few more minutes. We often get questions about incentives and kind of where it fits and kind of where its place in a traditional kind of business life cycle fits. And so we'll spend a couple more slides talking about that. And these questions are important. So why are there incentives in the first place? And that's these monies and resources are available to businesses today in an unprecedented way, but before the pandemic, usually for bespoke needs. Maybe it's training, maybe it's job growth, maybe it's a headquarters project, a retail store, whatever it is, it is meant to induce business behavior in a certain way that elected officials and representatives and stakeholders want it to be induced. That's the main purpose. The benefits of communities are jobs, new jobs, retaining meaning keeping them in place, capital investments, and so on. There's incentives for something as small as a new HVAC system and something as big as a brand new facility. But those benefits to the communities are big. Tax basis, recurring revenue, and so on. Expand and economic impact is important in the community. The benefit to the business is hopefully some cost savings and the ability to maybe make a business case work because you get some additional tax savings or grants or programs or whatever it is. And in today's world, even around workforce, it's becoming so key because those workforce components allow those companies to tap into those programs to maybe get access to more people that can plug into their site, hopefully lowering attrition or attacking attrition for the betterment of that workforce, to retain those workers as best as possible, upskill, and so on. So the benefits are big, but the additional resources and the technical assistance really brings confidence to a project to either close or become that much more successful. And so the way these are typically structured, I don't know, many of you have worked around incentives, but it's worth talking about briefly. It'll they'll dovetail into how we talk about incentives now today. First, a company makes an investment, jobs, capital, some kind of commitment, real estate transaction, whatever it is. The public entity, city, state, region, federal government, lots of other different entities makes their investment. They come together. Usually there's an agreement. Our team has an in-house legal component that helps navigate all these agreements because the details are important, and the commitments that a company makes, as well as the commitments of a public entity or an incentive body makes, is important. Those all come together in an agreement. And eventually you've got something that is then an incentive process of which the company performs, and the government or applicable entity gives resources back in return. And that's the compliance period. And so sometimes compliance can last a year, 2 years, sometimes it could be 10 years. It's usually the length of the incentive benefit itself, plus a year or so of kind of aftercare to close the docket and finish up the incentive. But it's an important piece in the life cycle of a particular program. Lastly, before we get into some of the driving factors and some of the specific incentives, who's eligible and what are those triggers that really help companies make a decision? Well, sudden shock is the experience that we've all been feeling over the last few years. It's unprecedented, to say the least, and that's a very overutilized word, but it's a basic way to describe the times that we live in. But governments have been responsive in ways that are also unprecedented. So you've got governments that are responding to the health crisis, some economic crises, and we're just here in the U.S. and in New England just about to get into the kind of put people back to work phase. So the health crisis seems to have subsided. Mask mandates and other mandates are starting to subside, and so many governments are retooling to think, all right, how can we get people back to work? How can we get people off the sidelines into jobs? People in jobs upskilled into new positions, and so on and so forth. Get the gears turning on the economy again. And so a lot of the first kind of trigger event that's happened has dumped unprecedented amount of aid in the whole ecosystem of incentives. We're going to talk about that today quite a bit. The next is for CapEx. So major investments, a new line, a new set of office retooling, some TI, some new computers or a new HVAC system, whatever it is. Often in a lot of jurisdictions, that's a trigger. So in some places, you don't have to create new jobs. You just have to promise to retain them. But if you're making a capital investment, that can trigger an incentive because you're recommitting to that site by putting money on the table to make a new investment. Of course, human capital gets a lot of attention. So in the front pages of papers, governors, mayors, and others tout when there's jobs being created, companies make big announcements. That's important. New jobs are key, but retained jobs are okay too, because everybody knows across the whole country and beyond, we're all having trouble with our workforce, retaining them. The quit rates are the great resignation, they call it, but these quit rates are through the roof. And so many governments are stepping up to say, how can I help? And this is a big way, is through human capital aligned incentives. Acquisitions in real estate, as they kind of dove together. So an M&A process, as people are acquiring opportunities, they acquire the real estate, that is also a trigger often for incentives. It creates some uncertainty as well as some opportunity. And so that's a trigger event as well. And then finally, around energy and sustainability, not just about solar panels and other things, but just tapping into new renewable investments is key as well. So lighting inside a distribution center is a great example of something that may not seem as impactful, probably not a major investment, but that there's incentives to help companies do that, which is exciting. So another recent poll question that we asked is, what are the primary factors driving incentive opportunities? So both companies, location advisors, economic developers, they all looked at these top and they ranked the top two. So what we found, also fascinating, probably not a huge shock, but the top two factors were location and then workforce and wages. You know, the big question today is, what kind of assistance can I get just to try to increase my wages a little bit or become more competitive or find new people that, hey, I will spend $100,000 training this new person that doesn't have a lot of experience, but I just need somebody to train. That's how desperate a lot of companies have become. And so there's incentives out there to help do that and to help make the ends meet, both financially, but also through the government system of trying to get people in. And this is not always traditional government workforce resources. There's a lot of non-traditional, really exciting stuff that's happening all over the country and in New England, outside of New England, and we'll talk about those few in a minute. So the primary factors to consider, and we're going to dive into the incentives next, but one more thing, primary factors to consider. When you think about incentives, think about the location is important. Some jurisdictions, there may not be any incentives. The next town over, there might be a lot of assistance available. The next time after that, very different. So it's really dependent on location, and that's important from a factor standpoint. Your workforce wages, the amount of those wages, aggregate or non-aggregate, all important. The capital investment, if there's R&D expenditures or R&D, you don't have to have a lab with 100 people in lab coats. Research and development, as you know, is very dynamic. It could be software, it could be developing something new, a new process. That can be an opportunity as well. It doesn't always have to be kind of traditional with beakers and moving liquid around. The R&D is a big category. It can be a trigger point and an opportunity for incentives. And then finally, tax liability. So personal property tax, real estate property tax, sales, use, all kind of different localized taxes. Those are all things that sometimes can be abated or rebated or just become an incentive if otherwise could save and make a business case or a business more successful. So the next part of the session, we're going to dive right into the world of incentives. We're going to start with the federal government first. Then we're going to talk about some really unique states to kind of frame the more kind of localized level. And then we're going to talk about very specifically about New England, some of the programs and some of the things that are right off the legislative menu as legislatures continue to churn out in a pretty aggressive way new programs to try to help businesses. And then we'll right at the end, we'll talk about Canada and Mexico really quick. I know some of you have customers, clients that are looking at kind of a North American strategy. So we wanted to share those with you as well. So I'm going to go through this a little quickly. As Amanda mentioned, we're recording this, so feel free to go back and then we'll share the PowerPoint deck as well to refer to. And then obviously get a hold of any of us if we could be of assistance in just answering any questions you have about the things that are in here. But there's a lot because there's a lot going on. So bear with me a little bit, but we're going to start on the federal side. And though all of you know, Congress has been a little busy. They haven't been busy in a while, but they've been really busy over the last couple of years. The first big thing that they passed were different components of legislation that helped the health crisis that we're still faced with, of course. But they helped inject an unprecedented amount of capital, up to $2 trillion in just the American Rescue Plan Act alone. But this act in particular had a lot of stimulus and opportunities that kind of translate and eventually kind of trickle down into some of the projects you might be working on. So a lot of the funding streams that are available now to local governments and economic development agencies, I mean, we're talking about billions and billions of dollars. All of that is beginning, and as some more substantially than others have trickled now down to these communities. So if ever you were dealing with a county or a region, or even in some instances a state, and the county or region said, you know what, we don't have the resources. They have the resources now in a really unprecedented way. The gap is that, especially as you go more local, they don't always know how to capture it or how to make sure they're following the very important rules of which they have to follow to make sure that that they're utilizing the funds in the appropriate and specific ways that Congress intended them to do. And they have accountability and paperwork they have to fill out. And so where we come in and others is to help them navigate that process on behalf of eventually a customer that can use this, a company that can use these benefits. But it's very substantial. It's not just PPP and other tax benefits that we've been very well advertised all over. They're actually infrastructure opportunities. So if you have a manufacturing plant, needs a rail upgrade or a new site access or an office building that might need some assistance, especially if it's adjacent to public things that could be activated. All of that stuff could be eventually triggered through this program, which is really exciting. So how this breaks down a bit is that almost $2 trillion, $350 billion has gone to states, counties, cities, local governments, and then $10 billion to capital improvement projects. So specifically earmarked for household, small businesses, and impacted industries. It's a pretty broad category. It can be used in a lot of different ways. So it's been really important, and we've been tracking this in real time, is that in certain jurisdictions, they've identified the tourism industry. So in other words, hotels and other kind of hospitality things can be activated with this money to help. Other areas have looked at theaters and other components that have been hard hit, restaurants. Other communities have built spec buildings for distribution with this money. It's pretty broad, and often it's found to be a little bit too broad, where a lot of local communities especially are struggling on how to connect the dots between these massive amount of funds that are available to them for this purpose and the projects of which they have in front of them or will have in front of them. So because it's for water, sewer, because it's for all kinds of different nonprofits and other public entities, the struggle has been, and we found this during the stimulus back in 2009, there's just so much money, and they're constantly looking for projects of which they could help invest that'll be great for their community, and that's the critical part. So the other part is who got the most. So for the most part, it was very much driven by population, but as you can see here, the New England region still got a substantial amount of funding through that recovery fund, just the recent one. So I'm not referring to the one there's been 5 or 6 of them in this category. You remember the early stimulus that we're helping with getting tests done, getting hospitals down, getting more boots on the ground for nurses. So those are funds that were given before this one. This was specifically about getting things going again. This is also not specifically infrastructure and some other things. Along the same lines, there was a $1 trillion spending bill on infrastructure. So federal government is very complicated, and we tried to get it as uncomplicated as possible using colors and boxes and to kind of connect the dots a little bit. But there's a massive amount of money. They're trying to get it out as fast as they can. The good news is that it doesn't have to be doled out all at one time. It's actually over a series of years, so it's not an emergency. If you don't have a project right this second, it's not an emergency to go after. But if you've got a project in the queue, or you're trying to prospect something, or you're trying to help a company with a problem, there is quite a bit of money to be able to help. It's not a blank check by any means, but it's really meant to, if you've got a project, especially if it has an infrastructure challenge, again, rail access, site access, there's a problem with sewer, there's a problem with if it's a greenfield facility and they're trying to access certain pipes and whatever it might be around infrastructure, there are funds available to help with that. Of course, passenger rail, airports. I'm based out of New York City, so all of us are, I think, in New England collectively. So we're going to see a significant upgrade in Amtrak and some other things over time. But there's a lot of project-specific opportunities that are in here. It's just so big and so massive that it's hard for, again, local communities to unpack this, find where there is. What I would recommend, and we do this all the time, is recommend this for this time period, is that basically just make sure that when you're speaking to local communities on the county level and smaller, make sure that you're asking, hey, are you tapping into some of these funds? And some of these local communities will say yes, and here's how we're doing it. Others will say, well, I'm not sure how that applies to this project. And that's a trigger that they just might not know all the details. Unfortunately, only communities that have additional resources, and even lobbyists and other folks in DC are the ones that are navigating this first. And that's that's something that's a little bit of a challenge, but the federal government's trying to overcome that as quickly as possible. So we found some communities know exactly what to do and how to navigate this, how to apply for it, how to get ready for it, while others are lagging behind. And that's unfortunately a bit of a normal environment. But as you deal with communities of both ilk, that's something definitely to ask. Is that when you're working on development projects as well as other things, ask those communities, are you tapping into these resources, and how can it help my project? So switching gear to the US now. So the big thing around policy and programmatic changes, incentives, and everything else are three huge trends. Major opportunity that didn't exist before. Lots of companies that didn't ever think about tapping into government help did. Small businesses, about 94% of small businesses tapped into some kind of COVID pandemic assistance, whatever it was. It's huge. So the bigger companies, a little bit less, but still, most of them took advantage of some kind of tax break or nexus assistance, or obviously some larger ones even tapped into programs like the PPP. But many of these companies are asking themselves, all right, well, working with the government was actually a good experience. And for some companies working with the government, they were a little shy about, but now they're very much interested in maybe speaking to them again about what else is out there, which is exciting because the government has some great programs to help businesses, but there's always historically been a bit of a disconnect. So the opportunity is for those two partners, and you all being kind of in the middle, the go-between between the government and a company, or the government or a developer, or the government and an occupier. The opportunity is to bring those together. Now, what the government is thinking is two additional things. They want to target this money. So not everybody is in their sights. If you're in New Jersey, big focus for New Jersey is life sciences. Big focus for Eastern Massachusetts is life sciences. Big focus for some other communities are continuing to diversify their economy. Certain cities in Connecticut, it's about diversifying away from some of the historical industries of insurance, but it's also doubling down on insurance and getting into fintech and insurtech opportunities. So it's targeted often by the time that money makes it to the local level, and new programs are being developed to speak to targeted industries. Now, if your clients or customers or developers are doing something different that's not targeted, there's still opportunities, but they're very focused on, most governments focused on targeting that money towards things that they feel are going to need to be induced the most. And then lastly, and very important, is a major trend of transparency. So there's no such thing as free money. Companies in the receiving end have to commit to something. There's usually reporting requirements. It's usually, and it's important because as you do a lot of public funding, there needs to be some accountability. But the level of transparency is increasing a lot. So not only is a company receiving money, but it's going to be publicly known that they probably have received that money in the future. So that's just something to work with companies around. Most companies are okay with that as long as they can kind of understand it and wrap their heads around it at the earliest stages. But it's an important piece because accountability and transparency is becoming even more important with utilizing public funds for incentives and other things. So those are key. Across the country, more film incentives, more mega projects. Kansas is working on, has just finished a $1 billion incentive program, leveraging a lot of COVID relief for economic development and for projects of which we all work on. A lot of inclusive policies in certain areas too, making sure that if you're going to commit to a certain amount of jobs, there's going to be certain additional things that are going to be important, maybe inclusivity rather, other components that allow that government and that jurisdiction to maybe take some socioeconomic components in addition to just the job growth to kind of weave in. A lot of communities will do that in a way that makes logical sense, so that both the company and the community will kind of partner together in that. A lot of companies want to do that too, which is great. A lot of communities as well, so they kind of come together. But but there's quite a bit of inclusive policies that are being written in as well. And incentives are no stranger to major debates. There's a lot going on, and there's a handful of states here, Michigan, California, Ohio, Kansas. These are all states of which incentives has always been part of the public debate for a long time. But California, for the first time, has taken the California Competes tax credits, which are very significant, and they're available a few times of the year. It's highly discretionary, very competitive. And they've actually created a grant program that one recently closed. They're potentially going to have another one in September. But these are actually grants that are awarded, which California hasn't seen in some time. And so that's an opportunity. But there's a lot of companies asking for help in California, but there's also a lot of money available as well. In Kansas, I just alluded to this a moment ago, big mega deal incentive. They're trying to compete for a huge project in between a few states, Kansas being one of them, Oklahoma and a few others are their competitive states. But it just shows how incentives are still very important in the competitive process, not only for big projects, but for little ones as well. And it's huge for even, not only can you receive incentives if you're a business, but your suppliers, if they relocate or they're in Kansas, can also receive benefits. Ohio just recently won the largest semiconductor plant in arguably in the world. It was $20 billion, and it was roughly 600 million or so in cash and grants and some other stuff that are out there, plus other benefits. So it was very, very substantial. In Michigan, they just approved a brand new package, a site readiness fund. So certain communities in partnerships with a project can get a site ready. It's also great for developers. And one of the trend lines amongst these states, and some of the ones we're going to talk about next, is that they're still very much heavily incentivizing these mega projects. Again, trying to target, so semiconductors, extremely important in Arizona. They've added a lot of benefits to the semiconductor industry. We saw that a lot over the last handful of years in the Boston region for companies like GE and headquarters. That was always been a big focus, headquarters. There's a lot of resources being thrown to that. But in places like New Mexico, New Hampshire, Florida, there's a lot of skill development programs. So skill developments often are the least controversial because it helps companies and people alike get upskilled. And upskilling is really important. Right now, because freshman enrollment rates are so low, they're down like 30, 40, 50% in some areas, especially in the Northeast. You're not getting that typical upskilling. You're not having somebody that maybe had worked a job for a few years as a material handler in an Amazon distribution center, leaves that job, gets some new skills, goes to community college, goes to college, becomes a software designer 3 years later. That stuff isn't happening as much as just a fraction of what it was before the pandemic. So these programs are really important. New Hampshire has a great program called Workforce Pathway that allows that upskilling to take place, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Going around the country too, just around film incentives, there are more movie stars that are filming stuff and TV stars outside of California than there is in California now, and that happened a couple of years ago because of a lot of these film incentives. And there's quite a bit of film incentives in the Northeast, but it's important because the economic impact around these incentives are big. And even though if you have a brick and mortar kind of traditional project, things that align to or adjacent to the film industry sometimes becomes a targeted industry because film and TV and other productions are so important, especially in the Northeast. A lot of compliance change. So there are programs in the Northeast and beyond that required literally in the contract that X amount of people had to be sitting in an office. Well, it's not happening anymore, especially for the time being. So both states and communities had to act and adjust. So New Jersey, Illinois, Michigan, they all changed the way that they looked at people working physically in the space because that was a requirement in their incentive contracts. So now many governments, New England and beyond, are recognizing the fact that you can have 200 people working in a site, but only 25 people are there in any given day because of a hybrid schedule and some remote workers or whatever it is. Usually, as long as that person is in the same state, then that state is willing to incentivize that person. Once they get out of state, they're not having the same economic impact. So if you've got somebody that has an office in Massachusetts, but that maybe lives in Rhode Island, there isn't that reciprocity there. The state of Massachusetts is not getting the same amount of benefit at that point. So there's sometimes some dilution there. But in areas where you can count those jobs, and even if people are working out of their home 100% of the time, but it's in the same jurisdiction, state jurisdiction, then there's a way sometimes often to tap into those incentives. And finally, with transparency, Georgia and Mississippi both. So Georgia now does an independent economic analysis, which is good. So they basically get all the inputs of what a project might look like. So we'll give them the jobs and the investment and so on and so forth and all the different attributes. Then they put it into a machine, and that machine on the other end inputs what the economic impact might be, which often is not just the directs. If you're going to hire 100 jobs and make a $10 million investment, there's your direct. But they looked at the indirect and induced. So for every 100 jobs, or we'll say 10 jobs, it really creates an additional 3 or 4 jobs. So you're creating directly 10, indirectly 3 or 4, because as those people now are working at that site, other businesses in the area are able to hire new folks, maybe for lunch, maybe for other services, whatever it is. Then there's an induced, which means those 3 to 4 people that are in addition to the direct now have their own economic stimulus that's happening, and there's some fractional hires and jobs and investment that happens for there. So they want to do this analysis, and that's part of what they provide. And then Mississippi, transparency, which we see a lot in the Northeast. It's been around for a little while already, but states are slowly coming on board to this. Is that basically anyone that's got an incentive, once the incentive deal is done, that deal becomes public. Somebody could search on a website and find not anything confidential or proprietary, but just the fact that the company is named, Acme Incorporated. Acme Incorporated set up 100 jobs, and they're going to make a $10 million investment, and here's the commitment. They're not going to say what kind of specialized equipment they're doing. They're not going to say what kind of jobs, but just the fact that the public can be aware that this is happening is part of a transparency trend that's very much active right now. So moving over to New England, a lot's going on. So many of you track these things really closely, but huge amount of changes, a lot more changes to come. So we'll have an opportunity to come back maybe in a handful of months where we're expecting the state legislatures especially to continue to get programs in place to, again, kind of put people back to work, kind of post or the latter phase of the pandemic process. First in Maine has a lot of great programs, like the Pine Tree Development Zone can be really lucrative for the right kind of project. If you're willing to move a major headquarters there and expand it, even if it's already there's some great programs. Co-working development fund is also very unique to be able to set up co-working spaces, and tax increment financing, TIFs. Many of you are familiar with that. Maine has a program in which can really be impactful for even some smaller projects. But Governor Mills has launched a $1 billion jobs and recovery plan, and it's big. So agricultural investment. So that in Maine means also rural areas. So if you've got a more rural, not in an urban location project, or you've got a client that needs help to get better site access, a new sewer, new pipes, some kind of infrastructure, that can be helpful to them as too, and it's something to look at. The college workforce training program is also something as well, and apprenticeship too. These are more traditional programs, but they really help, again, upskill. So you've got a company, they're based in Maine, and they're telling you, I cannot find people. I've got 40 openings for jobs, not new jobs, but just I've lost 40 people and I cannot fill these jobs. Both the apprenticeship program and working with the community college through some of these funds will help take people that might not be specifically skilled for that job in Maine, but they'll get them upskilled. They'll get them kind of pre-certified, is another way to put it, so that they could be successful in that location. It's a huge deal because they're financing it essentially. So when they're done that program, they'll be presented to the company and say, hey, here's a candidate for you. And it just helps fill those roles. It also helps lower attrition quite a bit too, especially with apprenticeships, excuse me, that of course shadow someone that is a subject matter expert in that particular service or product or whatever it is. And that's a big deal from a retention standpoint. But $1 billion available, and they're very anxious in Maine to get that doled out. In the great state of Massachusetts, Governor Baker has also rolled out a similar set of programs, a little bit different though. So most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with some of the traditional programs that are available. There, brownfield redevelopment funds. There's some tax credits. There are some monies for job growth and some other components. But for the first time in a long time, that $750 million for grants and other things is a big deal because it allows the governor's office and sometimes local communities to incentivize in ways that we have seen in other places in the Southeast and beyond. So it allows Massachusetts as a city, or as a state rather, cities within Massachusetts to be a lot more competitive for targeted businesses. That again, isn't just life sciences and isn't just Google or Facebook or kind of known quantities. It's all kinds of different companies, and it's a huge opportunity. It's brand new, and it's something that we think is going to be passed. And the reason why we wanted to mention it is that it is once it goes through the governmental process and begins to be doled out, it's going to be very, very sought after. So it's something to think about now as you're coaching your customers and prospects and such. This is a big opportunity. In New Hampshire, a few different things. First, some really unique opportunities around these kind of revitalization zones and some other things for programs that are already in place. A couple of really robust programs. If you're not familiar with it, definitely do some Googling. It's a great program. On-the-job training is also key. So there's training programs that sometimes aren't as easy to use. This one is definitely on the easier side, and it can get that key training deployed on the job at the site as opposed to going somewhere and getting the training, which has lost wages and time sometimes associated to it. A couple things kind of navigating through the legislative cycle. SB 44 would be really exciting too, because it would then engage that community college system in New Hampshire in new ways to be able to again expand areas that traditionally were only served with WIOA funding or Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act funding, which is a federal program. It helps get underserved populations upskilled and ready to go at facilities. So it's something that when you look at some of those regions and you look at some of the businesses that are really struggling to find talent, the synergies are really high. So we're very excited for that to continue to go through its process. Rhode Island, although its size is very well known to be on the small side, they've packed some pretty big punches with some recent incentives. $2 million in annual tax savings is a big deal for this particular site, and it's important to note because it's a precedent setter a bit. It sets up a precedent for other developments and other companies to come in and say, hey, this was successful. Look at what this is doing. And we need similar help and why, and to go through that process. But they've got TIF programs, they've got tax credit programs, other vouchers, things. Main Street other components that are really, really lucrative, sometimes underutilized, and that really encourage you to look at some of these programs because they can impact, coupled with some of the federal funds, they can become pretty significant. And then finally, Vermont. A couple other really, really unique things I want to call out. First, the Remote Worker Grant Program is one of the most unique programs in that space in the country. So they grant money to remote workers to remote work because they know this program was in place before the pandemic, and they've tripled down on it, which is great. But that to be able to employ people in more rural areas that traditionally it'd be too far to commute into the regions of which they would go to a traditional office. The Remote Worker Grant Program, as well as some other programs, has been really well received, and it's been utilized quite a bit. And it's something to definitely pay close attention to. And then a series of proposals on the docket. They want to have a one-time boost to the tax increment financing program, the TIF program, which could be really big again for infrastructure, as well as some other aspects. And then some changes around the programmatic guidelines that would make these current incentives, a lot more easy to use and kind of broaden its applicability. But the good news is there are some grants and tax savings and some other things that companies can take advantage of now and in the future. To round us home, want to make 2 stops north and south of the border before we pause for some questions. First, Canada. Many of you probably work on projects in Canada or help with some Canadian efforts, particularly on the eastern side of the country, but I'm sure across the nation as well. There are quite a few opportunities, especially on the eastern side. So Ontario, you see one program here, but they're about to reshuffle their incentives and offer some new opportunities. So that's exciting. Nova Scotia and Quebec have some of the most lucrative programs in Canada. Quebec, Montreal, Quebec City, and many other cities, as a province, Quebec has an unprecedented amount of money for grants and other opportunities. So something to think about when you have some kind of cross-border opportunities as well, specifically in Quebec. And then finally, Mexico. If you're like us, we're seeing a lot of projects considering North America as a whole. Certain places are good for certain things, but Mexico has become incredibly important as supply chains are retooling, and companies are trying to figure out, well, how can they nearshore some manufacturing and back office and some other stuff. Mexico has become a really, really exciting opportunity. One challenge is under this new president of Mexico, they dissolved the kind of national economic development group called ProMexico. So it's now down to each individual state kind of makes their own incentive policy, which is okay. But between Mexico City and Jalisco and Nuevo Leon and some others, there's quite a bit of both targeted incentives as well as localized kind of grants. There's some closing funds like in Guadalajara in that region. But just something to flag is that the incentives are often quite a bit less. It's fractional from a value standpoint compared to the U.S. So in the U.S., you might have a incentive that would save $4 million. In Mexico, that same program, as it's tooled for the Mexican economy and the way the government works, might be less than $1 million. So the costs are less, so the impact too is calibrated appropriately. So your percentage of savings might actually be bigger in Mexico, but the total amount of value injected into the project is usually quite a bit less in Mexico, but still an opportunity. A couple more things to consider which are important. Interstate competition and community competition is still really important. So there are some programs that allow you to just have a site. You don't have to consider out-of-state competition, but many of you know that other programs, you have to be able to look at other states in a real way and say, hey, I'm considering New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine, and approaching each of those states with a project. And that competition is part of sometimes even the statutes of which they're required to have. There's no federal oversight in the US. So the incentives are primarily deployed at the state and local level, but we've talked a lot about the federal part, but the federal part is just kind of block granting money. There's no federal oversight of incentives, and so they're not there to overwatch what you do on the state and local level. They're just there to deploy capital. There's as of right incentives, so statutory programs. So you're in a certain state, and they automatically, for all manufacturers, abate sales and use tax. That's kind of like an automatic incentive, but it's important to count into your business case because different states have different taxes, and one state might be more lucrative than another. And then finally, discretionary incentives. So these are like deal closing funds. So mayors and governors and other folks will be able to deploy cash or savings or infrastructure for a specific project, kind of at their discretion. So it's really important to engage these economic development leaders early so that they could potentially turn on those tools if it's targeted enough, which usually means it's a certain industry. So like EV, batteries, UAV, all these different things are very targeted to a lot of places, but there's surprisingly a lot of other things that aren't as well known that are also part of the targeted. Diversification is important too. So if you've got a business that is different from everything else going on, if you're in a warehouse park full of distribution centers and you're a manufacturer, that's sometimes a really important differentiator that a community might incentivize. But for incredibly important too, you can't usually go sign a lease and then ask for the incentives. It's got to be before. So you go through the incentive process. You need to allow some months, not weeks, and work directly with the economic development leaders so that you understand what that rule is. Because again, the incentives are inducements. So, but for the incentive, the company wouldn't have hired these people or retained these people or made this investment or bought this equipment. So it's really, really important. And a lot of that flows to the transparency and their own return on investment. So they're giving the company $1 million, or what's their ROI? And that's part of the process as well. And finally, risk and reward. So you could get a blank check for $1 million, but what are the risks associated with that? Does it cause a tax nexus? What do you have to sign up for? What kind of work would it do internally to that company to be able to secure these benefits? All that stuff. There's lots of money available, but I'll leave you with before questions is that just make sure you're looking at both sides of the coin. Not only the reward, which is big in a lot of cases, as we've talked about, but also you're looking at what the commitments would be and the risks associated to it. And there's ways to make that work for sure, but we always have to look at both and the balance of both. So with that, really appreciate everybody's time today. I know we went through a lot of content, so you'll have this available to you later. On our website, there are a lot of reports available, Global Innovation Hubs, our latest, they're all free, download them at your convenience. And my contact information is here if I can be of any help. So Amanda, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you again.
Well, Jason, thank you so much for the time and for all, what a lot of great information in there. If people are still hanging around, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll keep the webinar here open for a few extra minutes. I know we're approaching the top of the hour. If you have to run, that's fine. And I do see someone has raised their hand. I don't believe we'll be able to hear you, but if I see it's David. Oh, Bernadette, are we allowed to, can we give David an ability to talk, to ask his question?
Yeah, I can do the allow to talk. Is it David Gilkey?
Yes.
Okay. David, we should be able to hear you. David, are you there? No, maybe not.
David, if you're able to chime in, that's fine, or please feel free to add the question in the chat. Jason, one question I have is, you mentioned so many programs. Is there any program that we should really be aware of an upcoming deadline on? You mentioned that many of these are being rolled out, going to be available for several years going forward, but is there an important program that we should be aware of where the deadline is fast approaching?
Great question. So it's kind of two. One is on the federal side. A lot of things associated with an organization called the EDA, which is part of the Department of Commerce. They're rolling out a lot of funds that can help with infrastructure and other needs. They can even, some funds can go to resurface the parking lot. And it's a lot of different really important synergies to what we all do. Those funds are being doled out really fast because they were part of two tranches. The 1.9 trillion that I mentioned a while ago was one, and then there's actually some funds that were doled out before that, and some of the other stimulus and COVID legislation. So those funds are being doled out faster than some of the other ones. So the way to circumvent it is just talk to your local communities as quickly as you can, but mention to them the EDA fund as well as just these federal money, so that again, they're very anxious to get this money out the door and into projects quickly, because there's a lot of transparency and legitimacy even in these funds, is it just showing that they're really working. So definitely engage your local community. The other is that in some states, not so much in the Northeast, but if you kind of extend that into like New York and New Jersey, there are a few cycle programs. So they'll fund a cycle and have an application period, like the New York State application. Those are some deadlines to pay close attention to. That's key. And then the New Jersey program, it used to be called Grow New Jersey, now it's called Emerge. It takes about 4 or 5 months to go through the whole cycle. So while there isn't a deadline, just something to keep in mind. It takes a while, and you can't announce the project until that's done. So you really have to start early.
Great, thanks, Jason. I do have David's question up here. So he's asking, are there consultants that guide businesses through the process?
There are quite a bit. So we're one of them, but there's quite a few that help with every step of the way. So our life cycle, like many other consultants, is to help with the identification of what's available before we talk to the government. It's good that when you speak to the government for the first time, have as much detail as possible. Ask specifically for certain types of money, not just money. That's key, because they got to connect all these dots. Then as you go through the negotiation and the legal and the other components, at the very end, after the company commits to benefits, there's the compliance, all this paperwork, filling out form A-123 once a year, once a quarter. That's all part of the process too. We provide those services as well, and many other companies do too. And so definitely, we highly encourage, not just because we do it, but we do highly encourage using a third party, because the complexity is very real, because governments are often known to be a bit more complex than they should be. And so between forms and the process and the approvals, having a third party help can be a big benefit.
I know we're a little bit, again, beyond the top of the hour. If people need to run, then that's fine. One other question, if you don't mind, Jason. You mentioned incentive programs, funds, tax credits. Are applicants able to stack some of these? And have you seen an example of a project that was able to benefit from multiple programs? And could you give us an example of maybe how someone put that together?
Yeah, it's a great question. You absolutely can stack them. Often it's a timing and alignment and some other things, but stacking them can have a lot of benefits. So a few projects that we worked on recently, where you've got immediate benefits that occur through grants and other opportunities, and then you have longer benefits that are stacked, but that maybe are recognized over time. So a grant often has immediate cost savings right off the top. Site prep, TI, whatever it is that can help immediately. Then a property tax abatement, like a real property tax abatement, can be layered in addition to that, but that often happens over time, over 10 years or 15 years. And so you can absolutely do both in all these different jurisdictions. You just need to make sure you're aligning to the commitment that you have to make for those programs and that they align together. So nobody wants, no company, no service provider, no government wants a company to pay money back because they haven't reached that commitment. So just monitor that from a risk standpoint as to the commitments you're making on that upfront grant and the additional layer of the long-term incentive tax savings. The commitment is usually the same. So you don't want kind of one to accidentally fall down, and it could be a domino effect.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jason. I think we're pretty much at the end of our time here, but we all appreciate your talking points, and this is all really good information. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to us or Jason, and we'll get those answered for you. So thanks a lot, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.